Good afternoon, everyone. I can see you all filtering in. Just give everyone a couple of minutes to make sure you're all here. Hello, everyone. So I think we're still probably waiting on a few more of you, but we might just kick things off now, run through a few quick housekeeping rules. I'm sure you're all very aware of Zooms, but just to run you through what we're going to be doing this afternoon, Adam's going to be leading us on this presentation. And we've got Sarah Whaley here too to help with the questions. And I'll be in the background if you've got anything technical, if you've got any kind of technical questions you can't hear or any issues with anything to do with the Zoom itself, you can pop that in the chat. So just to run through the functions that we've got with the chat below, you should be able to just pop anything in the chat that you wanted to. If you wanted to say hi to other participants, if you've got any useful links or anything you wanted to share, please pop them in there. Likewise, any technical issues, pop them in there too. And then use the Q&A function for any questions that you've got. And after Adam's finished with his presentation, we're going to be running through those questions and hopefully answering as many of those for you as we can. This webinar is being recorded, so we'll share the recording at some point in the near future with anyone that's registered that hasn't been able to attend, but anyone else maybe too. But if you specifically didn't want to be known to be in this webinar at all, you can pose your questions as anonymous, so we'll make sure that nobody knew that you were here. I am going to, I think, just give it one more minute for everyone to come in, although it looks like it's sort of settled down now, the number of people coming in. So shortly, just hand over to Adam, who can kick us off this afternoon.
Thank you. I seem to have appeared twice.
Yeah, I can see that too.
I just thought myself logging in. It's like, okay.
Duplicate yeah. You. It's quite scary.
Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ellen, for getting us set up for this afternoon's webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, yeah, my name's Adam Lockyer. I'm Head of Advisory Services for FWAG SouthWest. So my role involves a lot of our stakeholder working with DEFRA and the Rural Payments Agency around agri-environment scheme development, so working groups for the environmental land management schemes and the current countryside stewardship. And so work sessions like this are quite helpful from our perspective in terms of getting your feedback on the schemes and your experiences, as well as providing an opportunity for us to impart the information that we've got access to from our stakeholder work and our normal day-to-day advisory services. So thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I've got a relatively short presentation, and there'll be plenty of time to pick up any questions as we go to talk through each of the schemes within the environmental land management scheme. And also we'll share the slides afterwards with some of the key links to the main resources that hopefully you'll find useful. So I will share my screen and we'll get started. What if I there? So I'm only working on one screen, so I don't quite have the not got quite set up as I would like it normally. Right, let's start the slideshow. Okay, is that working fine, Ellen?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah,
ideal.
looks good to me.
So today I wanted to focus purely on the latest updates from DEFRA around the environmental land management schemes, and so that's the ELMS prospectus that DEFRA published 3 weeks ago or so now, and that will give, and that's really to cover the key changes that we're we're aware of for countryside stewardship in this year, and also changes to the sustainable farming incentive, plus a little bit more about the local nature recovery and how that's developing, but primarily focusing on SFI and countryside stewardship. So DEFRA have announced the standards for the sustainable farming incentive in 2023. So the expansion of the current 3 standards that are available with 6 new ones. Bit of information about the SFI prospectus and what we're expecting to change and come within, I should actually say ELM's prospectus, not SFI, over the coming years in terms of the way that the schemes operate. And as I say, landscape recovery, the second round we're expecting this spring. I'm going to start off with a relatively high level overview of those key changes, and then come back to talking about a bit more detail about the standards that we've got coming through in SFI 2023 at the end, once we've had a Q&A session. I'm not going to dwell on DEFRA's wider policy stuff, but just as a quick reminder that the outcomes that DEFRA are aiming to deliver through the Environmental Land Management Scheme, food production, DEFRA are making much more effort in terms of recognising within their communications now than they perhaps have done in the past. Farming productivity, so we are waiting for the final details of the Farming and Equipment Technology Fund, the latest round, which is imminent for small grants for farm productivity. And then the classic agri-environment scheme priorities around wildlife-rich habitats, water quality, drought and flood resilience, woodland and tree cover, and the management of trees. It's quite important, I think, when we're talking about woodlands and trees from a DEFRA perspective, there is increasing focus on trees outside of woodlands. So that includes agroforestry and hedgerow trees and individual infield trees beyond just planting of woodlands in large blocks. And then supporting farmers to mitigate against climate change and reducing emissions through carbon storage within habitats and soils on the farm, and production efficiency, reducing overall emissions, but also around supporting the industry to adapt to the change that we're already experiencing and change that we're locked into in the years to come. And that little formula in the red is comes from Janet Hughes, the DEFRA director responsible for this work, and really kind of summarizes what DEFRA are trying to achieve in terms of how those outcomes can be realized. And so the changes that they're making to the schemes are driven around helping to increase the level of uptake of the schemes, so that we're having a high level of participation with DEFRA. I think now looking at 70% farmers taking up one or more of the current or the environmental land management schemes over the course of the transition period up till 2027. And multiplying across that ambition. So DEFRA are looking to increase the environmental ambition within what they're offering, and filling the gaps in countryside stewardship to help to increase what can be achieved. And increasingly looking at how that can be joined up between farms across multiple holdings to incentivize collaboration to help make things function ecologically in a better way, for example. So joining up people as well will help to achieve those outcomes that we've just set out below. So that's just it from a kind of policy background perspective. So the prospectus itself, which is now being published, gives us a lot more certainty around the direction of travel for the next few years within the schemes. And that's been one of the big pieces of feedback from stakeholders and to DEFRA over the past few years. Now, it's always quite important, I think, to look at some of this in context, because although it has been confusing and it's certainly not been ideal for many people, and there are a lot of challenges. We've got to remember that when previous agri-environment schemes have been, new schemes have been launched in recent history, we've had significant issues with old schemes ending and then having a gap in provision of a replacement scheme. And DEFRA are really looking to try and make sure that there's no cliff edge in the funding and the way that the environment and farming is supported in the country through this transition period. And the consequence of that has then been that we've had new schemes coming out whilst existing schemes are operating. Perhaps some of the not the objectives, but some of the way that the scheme is developing in terms of the speed and rollout of new elements has kind of come and gone based on DEFRA's sort of learning on the fly through the pilots that they've been undertaking. And so it is very confusing. It has lacked certainty and there's been a lot of promise, but I think it's really important just to remember that what we're ending up with as a consequence is something that ultimately actually provides a lot more flexibility to farmers wanting to go into schemes. It's providing a lot more certainty now in terms of understanding what's coming, and just makes it that bit easier to work with in the longer term from everyone's point of view. I say, not acknowledging that that doesn't make it straightforward and has been very confusing for people. So the prospectus that's been published includes the actions which DEFRA will fund, the timescales as to when we expect these things to be available, and an indication of the payment rates which the schemes will operate under. There's some new terminology within the sustainable farming incentive, which is slightly different to the way countryside stewardship has operated. Where countryside stewardship has options, the sustainable farming incentive refers to standards. And then within the standards, we have a series of actions which are sort of similar to what we would think of as options in countryside stewardship. So that's why you'll see actions being referred to a lot more from DEFRA communications. Within the schemes, within the suite of schemes that make up ELMS, over 250 will continue from what we have currently within countryside stewardship, and another 30 or so completely new actions. Now, all of those options and actions are published in an annex at the back of the prospectus. We've also taken that and put it into an Excel spreadsheet to make it a bit easier to filter through and sort and explore what's there based on your farming system. And so we can share that spreadsheet with the notes off the back of this session, which hopefully will make it a bit easier for you to explore through what's new, what's changing, and what's being proposed in terms of payment rates for those things. So that's the detail which is included within the wider ELMS prospectus. I'm going to move on next to talk about, it's a bit of a test because I can't see the presenter view to see what my next slide is, but we'll go on to talk about the sustainable farming incentive itself in particular for 2023. So DEFRA have refined or changed what they're offering based on what they've learned from the SFI pilot and also the 2022 application round for SFI. The main changes which are occurring is, one, they've broadened the offer. So previously DEFRA were proposing to launch 3 new standards this year, but there'll be 6 launched this summer. We don't know precisely when, but the expectation is it will be within the countryside stewardship application window so that people can think about the 2 operating side by side, and offering more flexibility. And we'll see that when we talk about the standards in a little bit more detail in a minute. But the uptake for SFI has been low up till now, mainly because of relatively low payment rates within the standards that have been offered, and also the limited scope of the standards. But for this year, sorry, I've lost control of my mouse. So for this year, the 6 standards which are being introduced are the hedgerow management standard, integrated pest management, nutrient management, and arable and horticultural land, which is more the sort of conservation biodiversity land management practices to complement the soil standard that already exists, and an improved grassland and low input grassland standard, again, to focus on the sort of conservation above ground biodiversity outcomes alongside the improved grass and soil standard that we already have. Now, what's changed within those standards compared to what's previously been available in the SFI is that rather than having 2 levels of ambition within the standards, it's been broken down into a series of 19 actions spread across those 6 standards, and farmers can choose which of those actions to take up. So it looks a lot more like countryside stewardship in the way that it's structured, in that you can pick and choose which of the actions you want to adopt. Now, the key things about the sustainable farming incentive that make it quite an attractive scheme, and we'll go through the actions in more detail after we've completed a sort of wider overview. But the SFI standard scheme are 3-year agreements. If you're a tenant, you don't need landlord consent, and if you lose access to the land during your scheme, you can exit without penalty. And that also you are able to amend your agreement each year in order to be able to add new standards as they come online. And so there's a lot more flexibility to kind of engage with the scheme and learn with it and build your agreement over time. And originally, when the SFI was developed, it was really aimed at targeting those farmers who have dropped out of environmental stewardship when that ended and not gone into countryside stewardship, or have not previously engaged in agri-environment schemes in the past as a sort of first step into the schemes. But with the introduction of the integrated pest management and nutrient management standards, and the flexibility that offers tenants and the ability to amend, actually is becoming a lot more attractive as a scheme for farmers whose countryside stewardships might be expiring in the next year or so, and certainly well worth exploring. Although I would, in general, and we'll come back to this later on, start with countryside stewardship because it does offer a much broader range of options, and there are advantages in terms of capital works over the sustainable farming incentive, which might sway it in your own individual situation. And then the final thing with the SFI, and we'll start for questions, is that you can apply for countryside stewardship standalone capital grants on top of an SFI agreement, and subject to avoiding dual funding or double funding of actions, you can apply for both a sustainable farming incentive on top of an existing countryside stewardship agreement, or vice versa. If you're applying for the SFI first, you'll be able to apply for countryside stewardship on top afterwards. But the key thing is just avoiding paying for the same thing twice. Most of those things are pretty obvious. So you can't have a low input grassland standard with low input in countryside stewardship. You can't have hedgerows in SFI and hedgerows in countryside stewardship, but you could have hedgerows in one scheme and the grasslands infield in another. There are some things which need ironing out in the actions under integrated pest management and nutrient management, where it's perhaps not so obvious, particularly where herbal lays and legume swards are included within the standards. But in general, sort of common sense does prevail in terms of working out whether it's a double funding option issue or not. And DEFRA have committed to publishing a matrix to help test whether you can apply for something or not because of the double funding. And the SFI application process itself is all electronic and online, and therefore you're able, the application process will do a lot of that filtering out of eligibility against double funding, and look at what you've got in your existing stewardship scheme while you're applying. So it should reduce the risk of any double funding issues there. So that's the sustainable farming incentive. I'm going to pause briefly there for any questions that have come through in the QA or in the chat. before we move on to countryside stewardship? So Sarah, is there anything to raise?
I'm not sure if there's a problem with other people typing in the chat, because I'm only able to send a direct message to the host and the panelists.
Yeah, Sarah, I think the chat is actually not working. It might be disabled. So, but the Q&A should be working absolutely fine. So I can't see anything that's come into the Q&A at the moment, but if anyone has got anything at all, even if it is something for the chat, pop it in the Q&A anyway, and I'll try and move it across to the chat. If you can still see the chat, can you?
I can see it.
Yeah, me
Yeah.
too. Okay, well, we'll just go from there. There aren't any questions in the Q&A at the moment, so
Okay, make it an easy
we're
one.
moving forwards.
Do people have the option to put their hand up if they did want to come in, if we've not got anything on the Q&A?
Yeah, that should be working. Yeah.
Yep, Sarah waved.
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully there's 54 people there who can hear us and we're not just talking to ourselves. Oh, there we go. It's always useful
Raising
to
hands works.
We've got someone's written something there, so at least we know there are people out there.
And
Okay.
there is a hand up actually.
Oh, sorry.
So shall I
just unmute.
allow Edward to talk? Edward, I'm gonna put your mic on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, there. I'm trying to balance the order of doing things, and what I found out from RPA was that those who applied for SFI last year and then have a countryside stewardship that's coming good in 2023, January 23, they automatically reduce the SFI if there's any doubling up ineligible options. Do you know whether they are going to do the same for countryside stewardship schemes that start January 24? So if I did an SFI this year, would they just reduce it by whatever the doubling up element was? Do we know that or not?
So you're expecting that you may well be wanting to deliver stuff in countryside stewardship in preference over SFI. It's
I was thinking countryside. There's things I'm wanting to do which are only available in countryside stewardship.
Yeah.
From what I can understand, cover crops is going to be easier to deliver under countryside stewardship than SFI. So that my hunch was to have the countryside stewardship as the major thing.
Yeah.
The SFI sweeping up, I can get into it easy enough. So, but I just would like to know that I'm not snooking myself, and also whether arable fields entered as eligible for arable options, rotational options in countryside stewardship are also eligible for SFI soils.
Yes, in general, they will. You just got to watch out for the cover crops with the SFI soil standard and countryside stewardship, which you've obviously already picking up on from what you've just said. I must admit, I would need to go away and work out and get clarification on the SFI reductions if you're applying for countryside stewardship, because the way that the application process will work for countryside stewardship is that we're expecting an online application form that's similar to the SFI process for stewardship this year, which will do a lot of the double funding kind of tests. It doesn't work well for rotational options like cover crops. So I don't think I can give you an answer. I'm going to have to go away and work that one out with the RPA. So I'm just making a note. Sorry, it's like fail on answering the first question I get. So hopefully I'll be able to get better for others as they come through.
Thanks, Edward. I'm going to pop you back on mute.
Adam, there was a question about acreage size restriction, and I just wondered whether there was an update in the recent 2023. So I put the link to the question from the government website, but whether or not that's still applicable.
Yes, it does remain applicable, but that will be removed at some point in the future, but it does still stand. The question around being in countryside stewardship that started in 2021, if you want to get out of it to enter into another scheme, then that is possible. There's provision within the regulations to allow you to terminate an agreement to enter into to a new scheme within the environmental land management scheme that's equal or better delivery of public goods. The only thing that we're waiting for clarification on that point from DEFRA and the RPA is that this year's countryside stewardship application round is under this is the same scheme as what you would have entered to in countryside stewardship for 2021. So it doesn't count. I don't think it counts as a new scheme. I think you'll have to wait for another year, and when countryside stewardship is well, I'll come on to countryside stewardship and its future in a moment. So at the moment, we've read it as you wouldn't be able to terminate that new agreement to transfer across, but that may well change. And so I've made a note, and we'll come back to you directly if we learn different. And a question about, can you apply for both hedgerow management and improved grassland and convert to a wildflower meadow? Can I apply for both hedgerow management and improved grassland? Yeah, there's some specifics there for I think that's probably better picking up in a specific conversation. I mean, yes, you can apply for the hedgerow management and improved grasslands, but if your aim is to create a wildflower meadow, then the improved grassland management requirements are not really going to help you with achieving that. And so you're probably better looking at other options, which are probably best being discussed directly. Okay, I'm going to go on to countryside stewardship, and then some of those things we can probably come back to in the interaction between schemes in a moment. So I can wake up my screen. There we go. Oh, it's jumped on loads. Oh, no, I'm going to skip through these and come back to them. So countryside stewardship. So DEFRA have abandoned the local nature recovery scheme, and it's the intent that was set out in previous DEFRA policy documents will be delivered through an evolution of countryside stewardship instead. This is where it's got a bit confusing in terms of the legislation has provision for you to terminate an existing agreement to enter into a new scheme if it's equivalent or better. And what we need to know from DEFRA is when countryside stewardship is considered a new scheme to allow you to terminate an existing one, because we were expecting local nature recovery to be launched in 2024, and that clearly would have been a new scheme with a new name. So is 2024 and the relaunch of countryside stewardship that point, or does it apply at any time now? Therefore, looking to expand and refine the options that are available over the coming years and improve the service. I think we can see from the work that's been done with the sustainable farming incentive to improve cash flow as being one of the examples of areas that DEFRA are trying to improve with the way that SFI now offers pays quarterly payments instead of an annual payment, and those payments start in the first quarter at the end of the first quarter after the agreement going live. DEFRA continue to try and find ways to break out of the income foregone cost calculations which they use for calculating payment rates on the schemes, which can arguably undervalue the public goods which those options might be offering. but again, that continues to be hard for DEFRA to justify to Treasury as a mechanism for making payments, and why they still work with Income for GOM. And they're looking to incentivize local join up of countryside stewardship, so increased collaboration. And so you may start hearing or have come across the term Countryside Stewardship Plus. And there was a bit of misunderstanding as to what that meant, lack of clarity in its definition, but DEFRA have now have clarified that the Countryside Stewardship Plus is effectively an addition to countryside stewardship to incentivize and pay for joined up applications, so collaboration between farmers. And so that could include an evolution of the facilitation funds, if you're familiar with those, or other incentives for multiple holdings to apply together to deliver joined up habitats between farms. Specifically for 2024, so the application round is about to start. The capital works, the period for completion of capital works is being extended to 3 years from the original 2. Catchment sensitive farming capital grants have been expanded across the whole country, although the reality that we see on the ground is that access to it is prioritised based on capacity within Natural England to process requests for endorsement, and also water quality priorities within local catchments, and directing the resources to those priorities. Farms who are in existing high-level stewardship agreements and countryside stewardship agreements can take on additional CS agreements, particularly for high-level stewardship agreement holders. That means that where you have holdings where you have maybe just hedgerows around a field parcel and nothing in the field, you can add in countryside stewardship on top of the same land to better to stack up the agreements, again subject to avoiding paying twice for the same action, and a move to an annual declaration instead of the current claims process. Now, for farms where you've only got non-rotational options, so predominantly grassland farms, and there are no changes to declare, so no mapping issues or amendments required, that will greatly speed up the claims process. If you have rotational options in your agreement, you will still need to declare where those are taking place, and so you will be directed to the same claims process as we've had in previous years for rotational options. And the application window is currently open for higher tier, but the application window has been delayed for mid-tier until towards the second half of March, and will be open until the 18th of August. That's partly because DEFRA are working on, and the RPA are working on a new application route for stewardship to speed up the processing of applications and help them to get agreements out more quickly in advance of January 2024 starts. So those are some of the key changes to this current application round that's due to open. Have we got any questions anyone wants to raise around countryside stewardship this year? Silence. Could get through this. Have we got any hands up? Anyone want to come in? I see Andrew's got his hand up.
Yeah,
On the question?
Andrew, I'll unmute you.
Yeah, thank you. Right. Yeah, I was a chap who asked about the getting out of. I seem to have fallen between two stools by starting my agreement in 2021. I was led to believe that, you know, when something else came along, we would be in a good place to go and get into a new scheme. But because I did it in 2021 and we weren't in the EU, then you know, we've missed out a little bit. So I'm eager to go and bolster my countryside stewardship scheme at the moment. Now, from what you've said just now, you're saying that we can add on things onto our current stewardship agreement. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment because I need to access just some notes that might just help answer the question. But sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I want to add additional fields into flower meadows and things like that, and also have some school visits on the farm as well, which I wasn't allowed to do under the scheme that I started in 2021.
Yeah. So I did have a so yeah, so the provision that is currently within the schemes is that you can you would be able to terminate to transfer from environmental stewardship to countryside stewardship, or from countryside stewardship to add in the sustainable farming incentive. You can have multiple countryside stewardship agreements, so you can add in new land and new options that way by having multiple schemes, but you can't overlap your mid-tier stewardship agreements. You can only add in new land at the moment. So that's where, as I said, in what trying to get to, it's not very clear at the moment, is that at what point is countryside stewardship classed as a new scheme because of the changes which are occurring to it, and that's what I'm trying to push with DEFRA and the RPA at the moment, to kind of cover off that particular scenario, which is, and to a certain extent, the situation that you're in at the moment, where you want to do more within on land which is currently within a mid-tier agreement. So it's still work in progress for people in your situation.
So if I've got a hedgerow that's actually around a field that hasn't got an option in it,
yeah,
would that count as being in the scheme?
Well, your best option there is to go into the low input grassland standard in the sustainable farming incentive, which is equivalent to the low input grassland option in countryside stewardship.
Right. Okay.
So that's how you can start to stack them up.
Yeah. What about ED1 then?
That's the educational access.
Yes.
Well, there won't be any dual funding issues with that against any. That's a holding level agreement option anyway. So that you want to add that in, do you? You haven't got it at the moment.
I haven't got it at the moment. No, I haven't.
So you would have to find a land parcel which isn't in any. If you've got any land which is not in any agreement at the moment, you would have to put it there. But you can't apply for a standalone educational access scheme. You'd have to put in some other revenue options on the parcel.
Yeah, I've got that option to do that because I want to increase my bumblebird mix, and also I want to. The trouble is with some of these legume mixes, if you want to bring them into an arable rotation, like you do 2 years sort of bumblebird and then you do 2 years spring barley, you've got to have equal size fields to do it, and I don't quite know how that works unless you get similar size fields, and then you've got a little quarter of the edge of the field that's not in the scheme at all.
Yes,
on the field.
Yeah, so the guidance is that if you're putting in a bumblebird mix or rotation option, you put it in on the smallest size that you can guarantee you can achieve across your rotation. So if you've got a 6 hectare field, a 7 hectare field, and an 8 hectare field, and you're rotating between those three, you put in 6 hectares of the bumblebird mix, and you've got to accept that in those other years you'll either be establishing more than that, or you've got something else in the other 1 or 2 hectares that you're not able to claim the bumblebird mix on.
Okay, yeah, right, I understand that. Yeah, So I've got that option so that I
Yeah.
could build up another stewardship agreement alongside the one I've got at the moment.
Yeah, and then where your land is already in countryside stewardship, you can fill some gaps with the sustainable farming incentive in the interim.
Right, and that let me get it right. So if I've got a hedge I've got all my hedges into countryside stewardship. If the hedgerow is in a field that I haven't got an option on at the moment, does that mean it has got an option because it's got the hedgerow in it?
No. So this is this is a good example of where you can put the two together. So if you've got a field, it's in the hedgerows for countryside stewardship and nothing else, then you can put the rest of the field into a whole field option or a part field option in the sustainable farming incentive, and that's how you can start to stack things up.
Okay.
Okay.
And get
All right.
and get the ED one option as
Well,
well.
that's countryside stewardship. So that's going to be in a separate countryside stewardship application on other ground. Right, sorry, we probably should move on to some other questions. But you can always get in contact by email if you want some more specific guidance on that. Any others in the chat, Sarah?
Yes, we've got a question from Jay Turville asking about existing agreement holders. Will any additional CS options have coterminous end dates similar to the existing original scheme?
Sorry, I might have to read that.
Yeah, I'm not. I think what they're saying is that if they added on additional options.
Well, you can't amend the countryside stewardship agreement
No.
to add new options into it. So you could end up with multiple stewardship agreements with different end dates on your farm on different parcels of land. But I think there'll come a point where you can consolidate all of that into a single agreement. And it kind of links into this previous question that we're still struggling to get the answer on as to when countryside stewardship has changed enough to be classed as a new scheme. And when that happens, there's a chance there for people to terminate multiple agreements that they might have built up and consolidate them into a single scheme.
Great. And then joined up delivery. How do we provide evidence of joined up delivery? Would a participation in a farm cluster suffice? And what if neighbours are doing things in schemes but are not in a farm cluster?
Well, so this is all to be worked out because Countryside Stewardship Plus is still in its development. So there will be a requirement for multiple farmers to sign some form of agreement between them to be able to get that incentive on top of the standard payments. And a lot of work needs to be done in terms of working out the rules for that. If one party then pulls out, how does that impact the others, etc. So there's quite a lot of work to be done there, and so we're not expecting to see that appear as a scheme for a little while yet.
Thank you. And then there's a question about what's the progress on claims being paid for CS agreements for the 2022 scheme payment? Is there a timeline?
Well, payments are being made now. I think the RPA's sort of target is to have 98% paid by the end of June each year, which is obviously 18 months after or 6 months after the end of the claim period. But a significant proportion of them have already been paid and are going through. So payments should be imminent. And I'm afraid you probably have to wait another couple of months before you start chasing, because it's still within the RPA's window for making payments.
Great, thank you. And then there's one more question about Countryside Stewardship Plus, and asking about how that will work if farmers have different Countryside Stewardship agreements with different options and end dates.
Well, again, that's the kind of thing which is being worked through at the moment. It may well be that it's a separate scheme or supplement to allow for that type of situation, but it's certainly it would be a common situation to be in, but we haven't been involved in any stakeholder development work around that yet to start to get an insight as to how it might be managed, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Adam. I think it goes back to designing the farming system for what works for you, and then trying to find the right schemes rather than getting too bogged down in how many schemes you can apply for.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Okay, so I'm gonna just got one more slide on the local nature landscape recovery, and then we'll come back and look at the standards themselves in a bit more detail. Sorry, the chat is over the top of the presenting button. So we're expecting round 2 of the landscape recovery scheme to be launched this spring. Now, the landscape recovery is the sort of upper tier to the environmental land management schemes. DEFRA are looking to fund another 25 projects to go forward into the scheme. Now that we've started to see what was approved in the previous round, we've got a better insight as to what type of things it might fund. But in this next round, DEFRA will be focusing on net zero, so carbon issues around, particularly, I suspect, carbon storage and habitats, protected sites. So that's land with designations on it, whether that's in AOMBs, national parks, or sites of special scientific interest, etc., and the creation of habitats. The way that landscape recovery works is that there's a 2-year development phase to the project. So when a proposal is made, and at that stage you have a group of farmers who are looking to deliver some common outcomes across a shared landscape, targeting somewhere, reasonable acreage, a couple of thousand hectares of land potentially within a group. Making that proposal is what outcomes you're trying to achieve. Then the next 2 years will be a development phase, costing out what's involved, undertaking any preliminary research or assessments that might be required before delivering it, costing out the works, and designed to fund things which countryside stewardship would be unable to do. And so some of the examples that we are starting to see within that might be things around species reintroduction. So it may be bringing curlew back into a landscape in one particular area. For some of the other projects in the first round, which had more river focus, has involved naturalizing watercourses and putting rivers back into their natural course, for example. More complex things in uplands, looking at open moorland management and linking up between landowners. So a whole range of different things from within the landscape, but things which are not supported or are more complex than a conventional countryside stewardship scheme might offer. The key thing for for landscape recovery to happen is for there to be a kind of some core group or an issue or an opportunity that people can rally around. And so it's a good opportunity for farmer cluster groups to tap into, because they're already set up with the structure and the network to be able to much more rapidly pull together a collaboration of farmers to buy into a project. It's certainly evidencing buy-in from neighbours, and having as contiguous a landscape as possible within the proposal is really critical to success of that. So that certainly needs to be driven by a local interest and a local priority to be a successful thing. And the funding within that scheme will offer up to 100% of funding based on the actual costs. for delivery. So it's a harder scheme to explain, and much more, slightly more complex in terms of kind of working out what the first steps are in terms of pulling together an application. So that's landscape recovery. Any questions there before we go back and have a look in a bit more detail at the sustainable farming incentive standards?
No questions at the moment.
Okay, right. So I'm going to have to skip back through because I've changed the order of the slides ready for sharing and forgot that I'd done it. So I just wanted to give you a bit more of a detailed overview of what's involved in the standards within SFI 2023. And this just gives you an indication as to how things are changing and evolving. So within the hedgerow standard, there are now 3 actions, which means that there's the potential to stack up to the point of achieving £36 per 100 metres payment for hedgerow management. And the changes that have been proposed are really encouraging development in the recognition of hedgerows in the landscape and their value and their management. So the first is to undertake an assessment to record the condition of the hedgerows on your farm, which pays £3 per 100 metres per side. And that's an entirely new action within the scheme. And that's designed to help inform your decision making as to hedges to lay, coppice, new hedges to plant, how you might manage them to improve their habitat value or their shelter and shade value for livestock based on species that you've got present in the hedge. So a really good starting point to build from. Then there's £10 per 100 metres for the management of hedgerows. So there's a diverse range of hedges with different heights and widths. And within that standard, you've got the option to cut hedgerows annually, so long as you incrementally increase their height and width each year. The advantage of that is that you're always retaining some 2 or 3 year woody growth within the plants in the hedge. And so there's a better chance of providing a pollen and nectar resource and winter food on those hedgerows. If you prefer to cut them on a 2-year rotation, then you can cut them every other year, so long as that cutting is delayed until late winter, which is obviously going to be difficult for some people in terms of their soil types and ground conditions. You can cut every 3rd year, any time from the autumn onwards, or you can leave the hedges uncut to grow out naturally in order to lay or coppice them at some point in the future. So there's quite free rein really in terms of what you do with the hedgerows, and gives people a lot more choice in terms of managing the hedgerows in a way that best suits the species that are present. So particularly for very woody hedges where leaving for 2 or 3 years can be quite difficult to manage, there's the opportunity here to cut more frequently, but to make sure that you're bringing out that hedge in its size over time, ultimately with the expectation that it will finally be laid or coppiced at some point. The question that often comes up at this point around that is there a minimum width or height for the standard? And the answer is quite straightforward there in terms of no, there isn't, because if you're cutting incrementally each year, the hedgerows will always be getting bigger and wider, and there isn't a point at which to stop with that, because we're looking at much longer term hedgerow management, because you're expecting to take it through to coppicing or laying. And then the £10 per 100 metres for both sides of the hedgerows to maintain existing hedgerow trees or to establish new ones. So there's an average of at least 1 hedgerow tree per 100 metres. And that might mean that you have 5 hedgerow trees in 100 metre stretch and 400 metres around the rest of the field without any, but it's the average across those total 500 metres, which would technically mean that that whole length could go in, because you're achieving that 1 tree per 100 metres. Now is for both sides because the trees are considered to be in the middle of the hedge, so you can't really do it one side or the other, which is a bit tricky, obviously, if you've got hedgerows shared boundaries with a neighbour in terms of who has management control of that and therefore who would be eligible to pay that. And we haven't really got the full guidance to understand how that scenario would pan out. And if you don't have hedgerow trees, then the scheme encourages you to tag trees to allow new trees to establish. And in terms of designing that and identifying species to include, that can be anything from taking on hawthorns to become mature trees, which is really, which make really good hedgerow trees, field maples, beyond just regular oak or lime or whatever you've got growing in your hedgerow. So it can be any one of a range of native species there. And so you can pick and choose which of those 3 standards you want to include within the holding. As I say, in general, we think that this is quite a substantial improvement in the way that hedgerows are treated within the schemes. So I can see some chat coming through there.
Hi, Adam. So just to double check, assessing and recording hedgerow condition. If you are already in the CS hedgerow option, can you apply for that SFI option on top of your CS agreement?
I suspect so. Yes, there shouldn't be any reason why not, because it's completely new action and it's not double funding what you're required to do within the existing countryside stewardship hedgerow standard. I would say that although the payment rates are obviously double and is quite attractive, unless you have an awful lot of hedgerows, it won't stack up to a significant change in terms of the amount of funding that the value of your agreement overall, but it is a good step up.
Thank you. And then there was a question around, is there a higher payment for leaving uncut on a longer rotation?
No, because because the sustainable farming incentive is a 3-year agreement, it's very difficult to capture long-term management like that. What is different to the SFI standard is that you can apply for standalone countryside stewardship capital grants for the hedge laying and coppicing. So that means that you do get that extra bonus for long-term management by being able to access both this standard and the capital works for laying or coppicing.
And then there's a question around, if you have more than 1 tree per 100 meters, do you get a higher payment?
No, but you can average it out across the whole length of your hedgerows.
Right, thank you. And then minimum size to be classed as a tree.
Well, that doesn't matter because as long as you allow that tree to grow on and head towards maturity, they can be young trees. I mean, there is a significant issue in terms of succession within hedgerow trees and a lack of young trees coming through to replace mature trees as they die off. So no, there's no minimum as to what counts as hedgerow tree, as long as it's tagged and protected from being cut.
Great, thank you.
Any more on the hedgerow standard? Move on to can't remember what's next. It'll be a surprise. Oh yeah, integrated pest management standard. So 4 actions here. £989 a year for completing a integrated pest management assessment and produce an IPM plan. That's a new action, so we're finding our way with that in terms of what's required, but it's all around describing how you intend to reduce your use of pesticides in general across the holding and increasing the amount of beneficial predators and habitats to support them, essentially. You can then access payments for establishing flowerage margins and plots, which are very similar to the AB8 existing option in countryside stewardship. It's 673 a hectare. Establishing a companion crop, £55 a hectare, which is an entirely new action, and a no insecticide payment at £45 a hectare, again, another new action. What's really interesting about these 3 new actions in particular is that they do have much more of a sort of agricultural farming systems focus to them, which again is really encouraging to see farm systems being supported in here alongside the creation of habitats. And we're going to have to feel our way and learn the definitions around what would constitute a companion crop for the purposes of the scheme, because that is something that's entirely new to us. Yeah, insecticides is fairly straightforward in terms of just not using them within your cropping. And for those schemes, you would apply for a hectareage per year on farm. So you may start with that on a smaller proportion of your holding, but because you can amend your SFI agreement each year, you can increase that your ambition each year by adding more and more land in as you become more familiar and comfortable with its use. So questions on that one? Oh, I'm hoping Sarah will unmute. Is there anything new on the chat for that?
There was a question again, just going back to hedgerow trees, which I think I've answered, but it said previously hedges were measured on node-to-node basis. And the Edward said that he thinks you're suggesting that if you have 10 trees in a hedge around one small field, that would enable 1 kilometre of hedges to be entered. But it's rather based on the length, like you have a minimum requirement of how many trees per 400 meters. You have to have 1 tree per 400 meters across the hedgerows, correct?
Yeah. I think you just got to avoid, and with a lot of these things, avoid just overcomplicating life for yourself by trying to kind of make the most of these things. But effectively, you're looking at your total, from our reading of it, you're looking at the total amount of hedgerow that you've got. And so you could do it 2 ways. You could look at the total number of trees you've got and work out how many meters of hedgerow that's worth. And as long as you've got enough hedgerows to put it in, if you've got stretches without trees, it would average, it would average out. So it is the average. It's the average number of trees across the total length of hedgerow, as far as we can see at the moment.
Great. And then there's a question again from Edward about ferric phosphate and grain barn fumigation, and how does that fit in with no use of insecticide? I
don't know. That'd be too specific. I'd have to go away and have a look, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay, and then IPM only available for arable parcels?
Well, I was discussing this with a colleague earlier. Not necessarily, no. Particularly any, I think there would be ways of integrating it within livestock systems, but I think you just have to look at that quite carefully and look at the individual farm. Certainly, if you're growing forage crops for livestock, then there's certainly the option to include it on mixed farms and livestock holdings. If you're all permanent pasture, then there may well be less opportunities, but there's still still options there around reducing the use of broadleaf herbicides within grasslands that could fall into it. Again, I think there'll be a threshold. There'll be a point where you're not doing enough really to justify the payment or the action that it's asking you to undertake based on your system. So an existing very low input all grass farm is probably not going to gain much from going through the process. That £989 is not free money. It comes with obligations in terms of going through a process and writing a plan. And so there's no point in getting the money to write a plan that you don't need because no one's going to have benefited from it.
Yeah, okay. I think most of the questions that follow on from this are around organic and grazing land and how, yeah, I suppose how they can access that payment for IPM. But yeah, I think you've answered that pretty much.
Okay. Anything else as you move on to nutrient management?
There's one more question about how many of the IPM actions do you need to do? And presumably that's up to you.
As many as you can. You
Yeah.
see, you can stack and mix and add to it over time. So you could just do the IPM plan to start with and then add on extra things once you've kind of got your confidence and know what needs to be done. So the nutrient management plan standard is similar, £589 to produce a plan to start with, but you do need to have a FACTS qualified advisor to support you doing that, unless you have your FACTS qualification yourself. For nutrient management, there's £102 per hectare for the establishment of legumes in the sward, which is a variation on the GS4 standard. And before anyone asks, we are still waiting to get clarification on how that can be stacked with the soil standard. They are targeting different things, but and common sense would say that they can be mixed together, but we don't have that in writing. And then establish and maintain a legume fallow. So that's a variation of the AB15 legume fallow option in countryside stewardship. Again, that's around building up soil carbon, providing a pollen nectar mix within your holding, and helping with soil fertility, and can be used for weed control as well within a rotation. So three actions there within that standard. I'm going to keep moving on unless I see a red light flash up on the Q&A or get interrupted for any other questions on that one. The arable and horticultural land standard. So as I say, this is a bit like just having a lot of countryside stewardship options for arable land bundled together. So we've got options for pollen and nectar strips and blocks within fields, a option for winter bird food, a new option for the establishment and maintenance of grassy field corners or blocks in arable land, which has been lacking for countryside stewardship for a while. So that helps to do arable reversion in small parts of the fields to put it down to grass, to provide biodiversity benefit, but also a sort of slight variation on the use of buffer strips, and then 4 to 12 metre buffer strips on arable and horticultural land, so much the same as buffer strips in countryside stewardship. Those are generally self-explanatory, but if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to raise them. Then we've got an improved grassland standard. Again, similar, just taking out variations of options from countryside stewardship. So there's an option for grass field corner management, an option for providing winter bird food, which is effectively by allowing improved ryegrass swards to set seed at the end of the season after the first cut, and buffer strips again on grasslands between 4 and 12 metres wide, variation on the existing grass and buffer strips. And so for many farmers who had very straightforward countryside stewardship agreements or entry-level stewardship agreements, the sustainable farming incentive does provide a potentially more flexible route to continue those types of options than by continuing with a new countryside stewardship application, for example. Then finally, we've got the low input grassland standard. And so for this, there's a lowland version and an upland version, and it's effectively the same option. The payment rates here, it's worth noting, are in brackets saying indicative because they may be changed. And there are a couple of key differences between these standards and countryside stewardship. one of those primarily being that supplementary feeding is permitted. That doesn't reduce the kind of outcomes in terms of what the scheme is trying to achieve, and so it doesn't sort of open up all grasslands to be included and allow you to creep feed lambs to your heart's content on them, because it still does require you to achieve other outcomes in terms of the diversity and structure of the grass sward, the tussockiness of the grass sward. And also there's a move away from the end of June as a cutting date for grasslands, and just requires you, well, the difference is that it requires you to have a minimum of 7-week rest period between grazing and cutting. Again, that's quite nice to see a change, and has been something we've been pushing for within our feedback to DEFRA, to increase the ability to have a more diverse cutting dates in the landscape, and allowing sufficient rest period for ground nesting birds to fledge young, or for wildflowers in the sward to go through their life cycle and set seed between cutting. But that can be tailored much more to the landscape and your land and your fields as to whether they suit better some early spring grazing and a later cut, or whether they benefit from being shut up early and cutting slightly earlier because the grass is mature and are fit for hay cutting or whatever a bit earlier in the season. So some interesting changes there, but as I say, the payment rates are indicative. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there because that's effectively the end of the slides on those, and we've got plenty of time for any questions. I've got a couple of extra slides on the back of there, which we'll include in when we circulate the notes afterwards, with some key links to the DEFRA blog, which gives a really good high-level overview of the prospectus that DEFRA has published, and I would recommend subscribing to that as a way of keeping up to date with DEFRA communications, as well as a link to the full prospectus and the form for anyone who is looking to terminate an existing agreement to enter into a new scheme. So specifically for those who are in high level stewardship and wanting to go into countryside stewardship as being the main route. And if anyone is thinking of doing that, we can come back to that process once we've taken any questions on what we've just covered.
I wonder if perhaps with any last questions, if people want to raise their hand instead of popping them into the Q&A, because there's nothing else in the Q&A at the moment.
Yep. Yeah, we've got another quarter of an hour to fill. Well, we don't have to fill it. You can have 15 minutes of your day back, but we've got plenty of time to pick up any specific issues that might be relevant to any of you.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, the awkward
Okay.
silence. Oh, there we go.
I can see Andrew. I'm gonna give you permission to talk.
That's very polite of you, Ellen.
There we go.
Okay. When does a newly planted hedge become a hedge?
Well, in the scheme for the SFI standards, probably from straight away, to be honest.
Right, and I've got to register that as an additional hedge, or?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, you would still, the RPA will still use the hedge mapping as the eligibility test when they're processing applications. That's a good point.
Right. Okay. Okay.
It does say for the hedgerow management option that what you must do to manage the hedgerows entered into this action depends on whether they're fully established, which will usually be the case around 5 years after they're planted, or whether they're newly established or not fully established. So I think the idea is that you have to just try and achieve the aim of the action rather than it trying to be too different, trying not to be too prescriptive.
Yeah, exactly. Edward, well, and do you unmute
Okay.
Edward?
On the SFI application, application and contract side of things,
Yeah,
if you're wanting to do some things on the hedge and some things on the IPM and some things on the soils, would that be 3 separate applications, 3 separate contracts, or would it be one whopper that has got the 3 strands to it, to which you can then add something if you realize actually I would now like to add in.
yeah, no, it's all one agreement.
X.
It's all one agreement. So you build up an application with each of those standards all in the same agreement.
But could you, in order, I'm a simple bear. I'm not sure I could handle thinking along those 4 different strands at the same time. Could I say I want to do the IPM first, and once I've got that up and running, right, now let's start the soils one. So I mean, does it have to be
a year
one
later?
whopper?
It'd be each year you'd be able to add more to it. So you'd have to wait 12 months before you added the next thing to it.
Right.
Great. Thank you for that. Edward, I'm going to mute you. And then Al Bathurst, I'm going to give you the microphone. If you just, I think there might be a button for you to unmute, Al Bathurst. There we go.
Could you say a little bit more, please, about the catchment sensitive farming and how that fits into SFI?
Yeah, so you'd have to apply for you'd probably have to apply for a standalone catchment sensitive farming grant. Most of those works would be in your yards anyway, so it probably doesn't directly overlap in most cases, but there may be water grants that you're looking for, like fencing of watercourses, etc., that might overlap. So it's perfectly eligible to do, and it's a separate application route in order to do it. So you can do that at any point, either concurrently with a SFI application, or once your SFI is in and live, or vice versa, the other way around. So they're completely compatible with each other as different schemes.
Thank you.
That's quite right. I saw John had his hand up and then it went down again. So I don't know if John Davis, we answered your question or not. Oh, he's back up again.
Back up. I'll just give you the mic. You switch your. There we go. There we go.
Adam, we've had some. We're in the middle of discussions about shelter belts as opposed to shelter woods. Shelter woods are fairly effectively dealt with under UCO, but they're very different animals with very different outcomes to shelter belts, which I understand we may have to wait until either BN11 can be changed to include them, or a completely different capital item. Which do you think is the best way forward? And have you any idea on timescales? Are we looking 2024 or beyond?
Yeah, I could have guessed that would be your question. That's fine. Personally, I think the simplest way that DEFRA could overcome that is to free up the ability to use the tree planting grants for the supplying and planting of individual trees to a greater range of scenarios, because then you don't have to prescribe precisely how to deliver it, and it covers a lot more opportunities. And that, in theory, could be done just by a policy change for DEFRA to increase the eligibility for an existing option rather than creating something new. I think there are other tree planting scenarios which fall outside of UCO and hedge planting, as well as the optimum shelter belt model where we could benefit from greater flexibility around tree planting. And so that's the route that I've personally have taken in terms of our stakeholder feedback to DEFRA.
Thank you very much indeed.
That's quite right.
Wonderful. I think there are a couple more
I think some will come in the
questions
chat.
in the Q&A. Yeah.
So I think people are asking for access to resources. I'm presuming that the slides will be shared.
Yeah, no, we'll share the slides, and as I say, there's a couple of extra slides on the back with the links to key information, particularly around catchment sensitive accessing catchment sensitive farming, and the publications that I've mentioned. And we'll also attach the summary spreadsheet of the new options, and also actually a comparison table of the differences between options in the sustainable farming incentive and their equivalents in countryside stewardship, which hopefully for people weighing up their options might just help with the decision process and visualize what's there but hidden away in the text of the scheme paperwork.
That's great, thank you. And then the SFI window for applications for the new standards, is that open?
We don't know. We haven't got a specific date as to when the new standards will become available. It's just been marketed as this summer, so we wait to see, I'm afraid.
Great, thank you. So I think that's answered all the questions in the chat.
Okay, one final call for any other questions.
Put your hand up now.
Okay, well, we can only drag it out for so long. I think all the hands that are up are old hands, the same people that have spoken previously.
Yeah.
Okay,
Great.
right. Well, hopefully everyone found that a useful, quick update. We want to try and just do these more often when DEFRA publish key policy updates, because I know some people like to kind of read these things, others like a high-level summary, other people like to have heard it and had a chance to chat it through. So hopefully this kind of adds to the material that DEFRA are publishing and give people a chance to focus on what we think are the key bits of information coming through from a policy perspective. And otherwise, I'd like to thank you all for your time and your questions, and see you all again soon.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much, Adam. I'm sure everyone thought that was really useful. I'll click end in a minute and then this will record. So as was already been mentioned, but we'll make sure these slides go out to everyone that came. We'll also put this recording up somewhere as well, so you can watch it again if you wanted to confirm anything. And obviously you know where we are if you need to be in touch about anything else. Great. Well, see you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.